What happens when a 20-year-old college student, trembling with anxiety and clutching a crumpled tissue, stands before a judge, knowing she can't pay the $180 parking fine that could derail her entire future? What happens when that judge isn't just any ordinary magistrate, but Frank Caprio, a man whose courtroom became a sanctuary of hope in a world that often feels cold and unforgiving? On a gray Tuesday morning in Providence, Rhode Island, the municipal courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm of hurried defendants, stern-faced clerks, and the mechanical processing of violations. But in Courtroom 6A, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would remind millions of viewers around the world that justice doesn't always have to be blind to human suffering. Sarah Martinez had been awake since 4 a.m., her stomach churning with worry as she rehearsed what she would say to the judge. A sophomore at Rhode Island College, studying to become a teacher, Sarah had received the parking ticket 3 months earlier when she'd rushed to her job at a local diner without quarters for the meter. She'd been working double shifts to help her mother pay rent after her father lost his job during the pandemic. The $180 fine, including late fees, might as well have been $1,800 for someone living paycheck to paycheck on minimum wage. As Sarah entered the courtroom, she noticed something different about this place. The walls weren't the sterile government green she'd expected, but warm earth tones. Family photos lined Judge Caprio's desk, and instead of the intimidating elevated bench she'd seen in movies, his seat was positioned closer to eye level with the defendants. The 84-year-old judge with silver hair and kind eyes was reviewing papers, occasionally chuckling at something his clerk had whispered. Other defendants waiting their turn seemed unusually relaxed, some even smiling. Sarah overheard an elderly man telling his friend, "Don't worry, this is the good judge. He actually listens." Still, Sarah's hands shook as she clutched the letter from her employer, confirming her work schedule and the medical bills from her mother's recent surgery. Documents she hoped might explain her situation. When her name was called, Sarah approached the bench with the uncertain steps of someone walking toward either salvation or doom. Judge Caprio looked up from her file, and instead of the stern expression she'd braced herself for, she saw genuine curiosity in his eyes. He didn't immediately launch into the charges or demand payment. Instead, he did something that caught everyone in the courtroom off guard. He smiled. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of a grandfather greeting his favorite grandchild. "I see you're a student at RIC. What are you studying?" Sarah blinked, momentarily confused. Wasn't this supposed to be about her parking violation? I'm studying education, Your Honor. I want to be an elementary school teacher." "A noble profession," Judge Caprio nodded approvingly. "The world needs more good teachers. Now, tell me about this parking ticket. What happened that day?" As Sarah began to explain, her voice barely above a whisper at first, something remarkable happened in that courtroom. The usual sounds of shuffling papers and muffled conversations faded away. Court officers, clerks, and waiting defendants all found themselves leaning in, drawn into what felt more like a conversation between a caring mentor and a struggling young person than a formal legal proceeding. Judge Caprio listened, truly listened, as Sarah described rushing between her classes and her job, supporting her family, and the impossible choice between paying the fine and buying groceries. He asked follow-up questions, not to trap her or find inconsistencies, but to understand the full picture of her life. The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed. This wasn't just another case number on a docket. This was a human story unfolding in real time. Sarah's anxiety began to ease as she realized she was being heard, perhaps for the first time in months of struggling silently. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered everything he'd heard. The courtroom held its collective breath. Sarah wiped her eyes with the tissue she'd been clutching, preparing herself for the worst, while daring to hope for understanding. "Sarah," Judge Caprio said finally, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of decades on the bench, "I want you to know that I see you. I see how hard you're working, how much you care about your family and your future." The pause that followed felt like an eternity. No one expected what Judge Caprio would say next. Behind every case file that crossed Judge Frank Caprio's desk was a human story, and he understood this better than most. While other judges might see Sarah Martinez as simply Case hash 2023-0847, parking violation. Judge Caprio saw a young woman carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and he recognized that weight because he had carried it himself decades earlier. Frank Caprio hadn't been born into privilege. The son of Italian immigrants, he grew up in a working-class neighborhood where every dollar mattered, and dreams of college seemed as distant as the moon. His father worked multiple jobs, his mother stretched every meal to feed 5 children, and young Frank learned early that life doesn't always play fair. These experiences didn't embitter him. Instead, they became the foundation of his compassion. As Sarah stood before him that Tuesday morning, Judge Caprio could see his younger self, the anxiety of someone who knows they're good and decent but feels crushed by circumstances beyond their control. Sarah's story unfolded like a familiar melody. A family hit by economic hardship, a young person juggling impossible responsibilities, and the cruel irony of being penalized for the very act of trying to work hard and get ahead. Sarah explained how her father, once a reliable construction foreman, had been laid off when the pandemic shuttered projects across Rhode Island. Her mother, diagnosed with diabetes, needed medication that cost more than their monthly grocery budget. Sarah's part-time job at Murphy's Diner, where she served coffee and comfort food to other working-class families, barely covered her community college tuition, let alone helping with household expenses. The day she received the parking ticket, Sarah had been rushing from her 8 a.m. statistics class to her 10 a.m. shift. She'd circled the block 3 times looking for a spot, knowing she'd be late and risk losing the job her family desperately needed. When she finally found parking, she'd fumbled through her purse only to discover she had no quarters for the meter. She made a calculated risk dash into work and hoped the parking enforcement officer wouldn't come by in the next few hours. "I knew it was wrong, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice stronger now as she found her footing in Judge Caprio's encouraging presence. "But I also knew that if I was late again, Mrs. Murphy would have to let me go. She's been patient with me, but she needs reliable help." Judge Caprio nodded, his expression thoughtful. This was the kind of impossible choice he'd seen thousands of times, people forced to pick between small rule-breaking and larger catastrophes. Most judges would simply note that ignorance of parking regulations isn't a defense and impose the fine. But Judge Caprio operated from a different playbook. "Tell me about your mother," he said gently. "How is she doing?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd prepared to discuss parking meters and payment plans, not family medical crises. But something in Judge Caprio's tone invited honesty, the way a kind doctor might ask a patient about their pain. Sarah's composure cracked slightly as she described her mother's health struggles, the insulin costs, the dietary restrictions that made grocery shopping more expensive, the fear that any additional stress might worsen her condition. She talked about studying late into the night after working 8-hour shifts, about choosing between textbooks and medicine copays, about the constant anxiety of knowing that one more financial blow could send their family tumbling into homelessness. "She doesn't know about the parking ticket," Sarah admitted. "I didn't want to worry her. She already feels guilty about the medical bills." Judge Caprio leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. "Sarah, let me ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. If you could pay this fine today, if you had $180 in your pocket right now, would you?" "In a heartbeat, Your Honor," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I know I made a mistake. I don't know how to make it right without making things worse for my family." The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the stenographer seemed to be holding her breath. This wasn't the usual rapid-fire processing of violations. This was something deeper, more meaningful. Judge Caprio was conducting a different kind of trial, not of Sarah's guilt or innocence regarding the parking violation, but of the system's capacity for wisdom and mercy. Judge Caprio looked at the young woman before him and saw not just her individual struggle, but the struggles of countless others like her. People caught between their aspirations and their circumstances, people who weren't looking for a free ride, but simply a fair chance. He saw the teacher she would become, the students she would inspire, the community she would serve. Most judges would simply read the fine and move on," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying across the courtroom with the authority of someone who had spent decades weighing justice against mercy. "But I've learned that sometimes the most important thing we can do is ask a question no one expects." He paused, letting his words settle over the courtroom like a benediction. "The question isn't whether you broke a parking rule, Sarah. The question is, what kind of community do we want to be?" The silence in courtroom 6A stretched like a held breath. Sarah Martinez stood frozen, her tissues damp with nervous perspiration, as Judge Frank Caprio's words hung in the air. Around her, court officers, clerks, and fellow defendants found themselves witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when the machinery of justice paused to consider not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of human dignity. Judge Caprio's eyes, weathered by decades of human stories, fixed on Sarah with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. But this wasn't about legal precedent or municipal revenue. This was about recognizing the difference between someone who flaunts the rules and someone caught in an impossible situation while trying to do right by their family. "Sarah," Judge Caprio began, his voice cutting through the courtroom's expectant silence, "I've been sitting on this bench for over 30 years. I've seen every kind of case you can imagine. I've seen people lie, make excuses, blame everyone but themselves." He paused, letting those words settle. "But I've also seen people like you, people who make mistakes not out of disrespect or laziness, but because life sometimes forces us into choices no one should have to make." Sarah's heart hammered as she tried to read the judge's expression. Was this compassion, or was he setting her up for a lecture about personal responsibility? She'd heard both in her 20 years, teachers who understood her struggles and others who seemed to believe poverty was a character flaw. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on his desk as he spoke. "You know what strikes me most about your case? It's not that you got a parking ticket, it's that you're here, taking responsibility, even though paying this fine means choosing between your education and your family's well-being. That tells me something about your character." The judge's tone shifted, becoming more conversational, as if they were sitting in a living room rather than a courtroom. "I want to tell you something, Sarah. 40 years ago, I was a young lawyer struggling to build a practice and support my family. I remember parking illegally outside the courthouse because I couldn't afford to be late for a client meeting, and I couldn't afford the downtown parking garage rates either. I got a ticket that day, $25, which might as well have been $250 given our budget." Several people in the courtroom leaned forward. Judge Caprio rarely shared personal stories during proceedings, but when he did, they always served a purpose. "I paid that ticket," he continued, "but it meant my wife and I ate pasta without sauce for a week. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, looking at that receipt, and thinking, there has to be a better way. There has to be room in our system for understanding." Judge Caprio stood up, a gesture that commanded everyone's attention. At 84, he moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned that every movement in his courtroom carried weight. "Sarah, I could impose this fine today. That's what the law allows. But the law also gives judges discretion, the ability to consider not just the violation, but the person standing before us." His voice grew stronger, more decisive. "And looking at you, listening to your story, understanding your circumstances, I don't see someone who needs punishment. I see someone who needs encouragement." The revelation hit the courtroom like a gentle earthquake. Sarah's knees nearly buckled as the judge's meaning became clear. "I'm dismissing your fine," Judge Caprio announced, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel strike. "Not because what you did was right. Parking violations exist for good reasons. But because punishing you serves no purpose except to make an already difficult situation worse." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob of relief. Around her, the courtroom erupted in quiet applause, an unusual breach of decorum that Judge Caprio allowed with a small smile. But he wasn't finished. "However," he continued, raising his hand for silence, "I want you to make me a promise. I want you to promise that you'll remember this moment not as a free pass, but as an investment in your future. Someday, when you're teaching those elementary school children, when you see a student struggling because their family can't afford school supplies, or when you encounter someone facing impossible choices, I want you to remember that someone believed in you today." Sarah nodded vigorously, tears streaming down her face. "I promise, Your Honor, I promise." Judge Caprio's expression softened further. "And Sarah, don't you dare give up on that teaching degree. We need educators who understand what real life looks like for families like yours. Your struggles haven't been a detour from your destiny. They've been preparation for it." The emotional weight of the moment settled over everyone present. This wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It was about the kind of community that recognizes when mercy serves justice better than punishment ever could. "Court officers," Judge Caprio said, addressing his staff, "please make sure Miss Martinez gets a validated parking pass for today. I don't want her worrying about meters while she processes what just happened." The laughter that rippled through the courtroom was warm and healing, the kind that comes after tension breaks into relief. As Sarah gathered her belongings, still stunned by the unexpected turn of events, Judge Caprio offered one final observation. "You came in here today expecting justice, Sarah. I hope you leave knowing that sometimes justice looks like compassion, and sometimes the most important verdict we can deliver is that someone matters." As Sarah Martinez walked out of Courtroom 6A that Tuesday morning, her parking fine dismissed and her faith in human kindness restored, she carried with her something far more valuable than the $180 she hadn't had to pay. She carried the knowledge that in a world that often feels indifferent to individual struggles, there are still people in positions of power who choose to see beyond rules and regulations to the human heart beating beneath. Judge Frank Caprio's decision that day wasn't an isolated act of kindness. It was a reflection of a judicial philosophy that had transformed countless lives over 3 decades on the bench. His courtroom became known not as a place of punishment, but as a sanctuary where justice was tempered with understanding, where the law served humanity rather than the other way around. The story of Sarah's case, like so many others from Judge Caprio's courtroom, would eventually reach millions of viewers through social media and television broadcasts. But the real impact wasn't measured in viral shares or YouTube views. It was measured in the ripple effects of compassion that extended far beyond that single moment. Sarah kept her promise to Judge Caprio. She graduated from Rhode Island College with her education degree, despite the financial struggles that continued to challenge her family. Today, she teaches 3rd grade at an elementary school in Providence, where she keeps a small framed photo of Judge Caprio on her desk, not as a memento of getting away with something, but as a reminder of what it means to truly see and value another person. In her classroom, Sarah recognizes the children who arrive without lunch money or whose homework suffers because they're helping care for younger siblings. She understands the weight carried by students who translate for non-English speaking parents or who fall asleep during lessons because they stayed up worrying about adult problems. When she encounters these situations, she remembers Judge Caprio's words. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is ask a question no one expects." The question Sarah learned to ask wasn't, "Why didn't you do your homework?" but, "What can I do to help you succeed?" This multiplying effect of compassion exemplified Judge Caprio's broader legacy. He understood that every person who left his courtroom carried his example into their own spheres of influence. The single mother he helped didn't just benefit herself, she went home better equipped to nurture her children. The struggling veteran he treated with dignity didn't just gain financial relief. He regained hope and self-respect that enabled him to seek the help he needed. Judge Caprio often said that his courtroom was a classroom. And he was right. But he wasn't just teaching defendants about consequences and responsibility. He was teaching everyone who witnessed his proceedings about the transformative power of leading with empathy rather than judgment. His approach challenged conventional wisdom about deterrence and punishment. Critics sometimes argued that his leniency might encourage others to break rules, expecting similar mercy. But Judge Caprio understood something deeper about human nature. People who are treated with dignity and given genuine chances to succeed are far more likely to make better choices than those who are simply punished and forgotten. The thousands of cases that passed through his courtroom created a unique laboratory for restorative justice. He demonstrated that accountability and compassion aren't opposing forces. They can work together to create outcomes that truly serve both individuals and society. Sarah's story represents just one thread in the rich tapestry of Judge Caprio's legacy. There was the elderly man who couldn't pay his dog licensing fee because he'd spent his fixed income on his pet's cancer treatment. Judge Caprio not only dismissed the fine, but connected him with a local veterinary charity. There was the young father whose speed reflected his panic while rushing his injured child to the hospital. Judge Caprio threw out the ticket and praised him for being a caring parent. Each case reflected Judge Caprio's fundamental belief that justice isn't a one-size-fits-all concept. Real justice considers context, recognizes human complexity, and sometimes finds that mercy serves the greater good better than strict adherence to rules. When Judge Caprio passed away, tributes poured in from around the world. Presidents and celebrities shared their admiration, but the most meaningful remembrances came from ordinary people whose lives he had touched. They spoke not of a judge who let them off easy, but of a man who helped them believe in themselves and their capacity to overcome their circumstances. Sarah Martinez, now Mrs. Sarah Chen, after marrying a fellow teacher she met at a professional development workshop, still tells her students about Judge Caprio. She explains that true authority comes not from the power to punish, but from the wisdom to understand when mercy creates better outcomes than punishment. This was just one case among thousands, but it illuminated why the world called Frank Caprio America's kindest judge. He reminded us that justice isn't only about laws and penalties, it's about recognizing our shared humanity and understanding that sometimes the most profound verdicts are delivered not with a gavel, but with an open heart. Judge Caprio showed us that even in the formal structures of courtrooms and legal proceedings, there's always room for kindness. His legacy lives on in every teacher like Sarah who chooses understanding over judgment, in every official who asks about circumstances rather than simply applying rules, and in every person who remembers that behind every case number, every violation, every mistake, there's a human being deserving of dignity and hope. Thank you for watching this tribute to Judge Frank Caprio. His courtroom may have been in Providence, Rhode Island, but his lessons about compassion, dignity, and the true meaning of justice belong to all of us. If his story touched you, please share it with others so his message of kindness and fairness can continue to inspire the world. In a time when cynicism comes easily and hope feels fragile, we need reminders that there are still people who choose to lead with their hearts. Judge Caprio was one of those people, and his legacy challenges each of us to be the same.